never get rain around here. Ambiance. I'm going to turn off my fan. Yeah, I wish we would get rain. That would be amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty.
Has it been really hot?
It's been in the 80s. It hasn't been too bad, but it's kind of oppressively humid, and this might break some of it. If it seems like it's a pretty good storm coming through, so
yeah,
we'll see.
I love storms. That's one thing I really miss. I feel like even when it rains here, we never get like thunder or anything.
Yeah, yeah, we have wide temperature swings, so that's it.
It's been staying really nice here, and it's gotten a little hotter, but it's mostly been in the low 70s, which has been amazing.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm never sure when we've started. Oh, here we go. We've got some people. Hi, everybody, as you're filtering in. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're just waiting for everybody to join. And let's see. And away we go.
One of them just celebrated its 100th birthday, the William S. Haynes Company.
I like this very much. This is a very rich song.
Everybody likes this. I wish I had.
Its owner and president is this man, Louis DeVoe, who started working at Haynes when he was 16 years old.
It's our 100th year.
100? Your 100th year?
It's our 100th year.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
When you were that 16-year-old boy and came to Haynes, did you love music? Did you play the flute?
I didn't know what a flute looked like. I just wanted a job. In 1941, it was still Depression before the war, and I just wanted to go to work.
Since 1888, the Boston-based Haynes Company has been making top-of-the-line, handcrafted flutes that have long been considered among the best in the world. Fortune magazine included the Haynes flute in a list of 100 items America makes best.
So would you say that these are the basics of flute making, right?
The basics.
Uh-huh.
Like that's the gold tubing.
Are these...
Over 330 pieces make up their standard silver flute. Except for that basic tube, every piece is fabricated there. Tone holes, posts, pads, springs, rocker arms, keys.
And this is a key that's set up now.
If the machinery doesn't look high-tech, it's new enough for DeVoe. Even this 90-year-old drop forge that hammers out the keys.
The keys come out, we feel, much better with this drop forge than they would with a hydraulic press. Hydraulic press would come down and make it in one stamp, but it's much better this way. When we keep hammering it, it makes a hard key, and it less have to break.
It takes about 130 hours to build and assemble the Haynes standard silver flute. There are machines that could knock out the parts in half the time.
Yes, and there's companies that do that. And they end up as a student flute. They manufacture 100,000 flutes in a year. But they're not handmade, and they don't last. Our flutes last a lifetime.
The Haynes flute is for the serious player, for the professional flutist. Jean-Pierre Rampal plays a Haynes gold flute. And so does jazz musician Lou Tabakin, who came to find a replacement for one that was stolen.
There's something about the sound that was very appealing to me, even though I'm a quote-unquote jazz player. So if the sound is not appealing to me, it's very difficult for me to improvise. The sound gives me the direction, generates the ideas. Especially the Haynes Gold flute to me is just very rich and warm and inspires me to play higher level music.
I say it's the best flute produced in the entire world.
John Pierny, known as JP, might have some bias. He's been making flutes at Haynes for more than 60 years.
It takes quite a few years before a man is capable of making a whole flute by himself. And it's just like filing a key. You got to shape up a key. It's just like Michelangelo. The only difference between Michelangelo, he used a brush, we got a file.
Doing a good job, Matt.
This is an apprenticeship. I just stumbled on the job. I consider myself lucky to work here.
Nathaniel Green started at Haynes 1 year ago.
I have a heritage in my family of architecture and furniture making. And although this isn't, it's comparable to that. It is old world craftsmanship, which they're doing here. And that's why I chose to do it.
You have to be a little bit of a perfectionist to do this.
Craig Stevenson.
Yeah, it has to be a part of you before you come here. If you're not like that, you just can't really do it.
Every flute is tested. How do you test a flute? David Whalens.
It's always some combination of how it sounds and how it feels. What I do when I check over a flute is the very first thing is the action. And that's, well, the body, all the keys, really.
David?
Your standard is enormously high here. Is there a way in which excellence is fostered at Haynes?
When they work on a piece, if it isn't quite correct, if there's a little thing wrong with it, very small thing, we take it and destroy it. Every piece they work on has to be perfect. This is the way I learned how to do it. Whatever I did the best I could. We don't want to grind them out. We just make a choice few for the professional flutist. We don't want to make 100,000 flutes.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully that was as entertaining for you all as it was for me. For those of you who are just tuning in, I'm Ben, Principal Flute of Pacific Symphony, and I am so excited to be joined by my friend and the world-famous flute maker, Aiven O'Leary. Hi, Aiven.
Hey, Ben. Hey, everyone.
Before we get started, just a reminder that if you have questions, we're going to save time throughout the hour and especially at the end to get those answered. There's a Q&A feature either at the top or bottom of your screen that you can use to submit questions, or the chat feature. We will see them in both places, and I will field those. Also, just want to thank our sponsors for this. We've got the Hendrix Restaurant and Bar in Laguna Niguel, Toast Kitchen and Bakery in Costa Mesa, Provenance in Newport Beach, Haven Craft Kitchen and Bar in Orange, Descanso Restaurant in Costa Mesa, and Adya in Irvine. And they're, as I said in the past weeks, they're all offering certain special deals and discounts for people who are going to be joining us for these sessions, and they're all great restaurants, so check them out. So like I said, we are so lucky to be joined this week by Aiven O'Leary. It's a little bit different for us. Aiven is not a member of the symphony, obviously, but I've known her for many years. She is the general manager and the Headjoint-maker for the William S. Haynes Flute Company, which, as we just saw, is the oldest flute manufacturer that still exists, and is world famous for their handcrafted flutes. Aiven is also an amazing flutist. She went to school at Ithaca University, or Ithaca College, and Indiana University for flute, and is a freelancer and teacher, and so she really has run the gamut of all things flute. So hi, Aiven, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Great.
So I guess just to kick things, oh, go ahead.
No.
I was gonna say, just to kick things off, I mentioned you're the general manager at Haynes, and you also make head joints. Can you just give us a brief overview of like what does being the general manager entail at a flute company?
Sure. So at first glance, it's funny, the two jobs that I do seem very different from each other. I was a Headjoint-maker first and then became the general manager at Haynes. They're remarkably similar, and I can get into that later. But as general manager, what I'm doing really is making sure that everybody that works at Haynes has what they need to do their jobs. I just really get to take a step back, whereas everyone else is so inundated with details. Everyone, we'll talk more about it, but everyone, and you saw in the clip, everyone who's working on flutes is incredibly detail oriented, and sometimes it's hard to see the bigger picture. My job is really to see trouble down the road before it comes. Make sure, I'm overseeing orders and making sure that everyone's working well together and that the parts of the machine are working the way they're supposed to work. As seamlessly as possible. Usually it goes that way. But so that's what, just overseeing the whole process is what I do.
And so I'm just curious for myself, and I imagine other people might be curious too, as a flutist who went to school for flute performance, how did you first get into flute making?
Total accident. So I went to school for flute, but I did grow up right around the Boston area. I'm from the Boston area originally, so I always knew that these flute makers were all around me. So a lot of the major flute makers, the American flute makers, are right in the Boston area. We're all within like 15 minutes of each other driving, so we're very close. So it was always in the back of my mind, but I don't know. I came home from school and I sort of just threw out all my lines. I had played a ton. I had worked really hard on developing my sound and my skill. But I wasn't sold that that's what I wanted to do for my whole life. I didn't see myself practicing and taking auditions and doing that for the rest of my life. It just didn't seem right. So, but I tried, I did a lot of stuff. And then one of the flute companies was hiring. And I figured I'd just try that too, because why not, right? I had no experience making anything. I'm not crafty. I wish I could tell you that I had some of the skills that some of my other flute making colleagues have, before I got here, but I learned everything on the job. And when I started, finishing. So I was putting the pads in the flute and making the flutes play, but that wasn't for me either. Again, I sort of found my way into the head joint portion of it, and that's where all of the work as a flute player actually paid off. That's where I can use my ears, and in terms of the fine skills and things like that, it's a little less involved than some of the other flute making processes. So I kind of got, it is very involved, but it's less fine tuned. So but much more ear training. So yeah. So I sort of found my way here, but I was lucky because I was coming back home to the Boston area and got to try it.
Yeah, that's amazing. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the terms of the flute, basically when we talk about a head joint, the flute comes apart into three pieces. We've got the head joint, the body, and the foot. And so when she's talking about the head joint, it's basically crafting a lot to do with this hole here that we blow on, because every little change in the shape and angle of that translates to a major change for the flutist in terms of how resistant it's going to be, how clear the tone is going to be, how it's going to react to different registers. So I think it's a very philosophical part of the flute in terms of crafting, I would imagine. And you get, and basically what I've always been told is that basically 90% of the sound of the flute comes from the head joint, since that's where the air is originating. Would you say that's somewhat accurate?
It's a high percentage. I've heard anywhere from 60 to 90. I would like to think it's 90, but
100%.
It's 100% of the sound. Yeah, but a lot of the sound is definitely, it originates there, right? Because people think of when air goes through a flute, it's it's not that the air is going through, right? It's actually hitting the head joint. So like when you're playing the flute, it's hitting that front edge, and it's actually making the whole flute vibrate. So it's not like some other instruments where the air is moving through as readily. So really, whatever we do right there is going to have like total, like crazy implications for the rest of the sound.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we have sort of a related question from Elaine. Hi, Elaine. So she's asking if all of the makers at Haynes are performers on flute. And in other words, do you need to be able to play well to make flutes and test them? And I imagine that would also depend on what part of the flute you're making.
Right, yeah. So we're lucky. Haynes has about 21 employees right now, and half of us play the flute. And half of us have gone to school for flute. We're really in a good position where we have flute players in every stage of the game. Having said that, you don't have to be a flute player. It helps with some jobs. It helps making head joints because I can actually interpret what, I'll hear a sound and I can make that into a physical shape, if that makes sense. I can carve that into a shape and vice versa. The same goes for the people who are testing the flutes. They can play a flute and they know exactly where they need to make adjustments on the whole body. So it's really helpful if those people are playing the flute. A lot of our finishers are flute players, but we have a lot of jewelers. People who literally went to school for art and studied jewelry making, and that really comes into play as you look at a flute. They're very intricate. They have to have a good eye. It's silver and gold and platinum, so you don't want to make mistakes. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as we start talking about the flute as an instrument, I think it's also important to remember that, especially compared to like string instruments, for example, the flute has had a pretty recent development. Aiven, you and I were talking a little bit earlier about how, if you were to go back in time and see the flutes that Bach or even Mozart were writing for, they were almost unrecognizable from the instruments that we would play on today. They started with no keys, more like a fife, and then started to add keys sort of along the way. And then in the mid-19th century, right, Theobald Böhm developed what we know as the modern flute, right?
Right.
And so what sorts of innovations did he bring to the instrument? Like it was basically like this system is a very particular system, right?
Right. So basically what he was doing was making it so that the fingerings were logical, right? So a lot of times, I've got a flute here too, in other systems, it cross fingerings and fingerings that didn't necessarily make sense were the way these instruments went. But now we've got a logical system where if you push this down, this is going to go down. So it's actually, it made more sense in terms of how our fingers move. Does that make sense? It was
totally.
It was all about making things. Any innovation that you'll find, and I think this probably goes with any instrument makers, it's really to open up more possibilities for us as players. And we're always thinking about this too. And Böhm was definitely, we wouldn't be here today doing the things they're doing if it wasn't for him. But it's really just to make it so that we can play better, so that our fingers can move faster, and it totally makes sense.
And I think it also sort of goes hand in hand with sorry, my dog is hearing something outside. It goes hand in hand with sort of what the trends are in the general music world too, because, if you think about Theobald Böhm, 19th century, and around that time, string instruments were even being adapted to play louder, orchestras were getting bigger, and you're playing more chromatic music, so it requires you not just to play. Like if you think about like an Irish flute or a fife or a penny whistle that have no keys, they're typically made in you get one for each key that you have to play in, because otherwise, like you said, the fingerings are too complicated.
Right.
And the fact it was made of wood made it possibly softer and more mellow. And so we're talking, having what Aiven was showing with like one key controls multiple other keys allows you to play in a chromatic setting a lot more easily. And the metal also would allow it to project, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's exactly why we moved to metal. As other instruments progressed, we have to progress too. So like the whole orchestra kind of progressed together, right? Somebody makes
Yeah.
an improvement and we have to too. And the flutes they couldn't keep up sound-wise with wood flutes. They were never going to be able to cut through the orchestra. At least, I mean, there are some flute makers that are making wood flutes now, more modern, and they can do that. But a lot has had to change with the way they cut their head joints and set them up to make sure that they can keep up with that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. And just so to sort of give everybody a little bit of an audio visual idea of this, I've got 2 clips and I want to share with everybody. It's the same piece. We're going to hear half the piece on a period instrument, so one that would have been written at the time in this, the early 18th century, I guess. And then one with a famous flute player, Emmanuel Pahud, playing the same piece, second half, on a contemporary flute. And you can just hear the difference. And what I want you to listen for is the difference in sound, but also the difference in pitch. You'll hear a drastic difference when we change. So here we go, hopefully. So I think it's very interesting hearing them back to back. We have a comment from Amira who says, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that the modern flute doesn't have as warm and round of a tone. And I think there's something to be said about that. I think, you know, the modern flute is like we said, sort of going for projection. And I think you're always going to get with something wooden, this sort of mellowness to it that is nice up close, but maybe wouldn't project as much. And if you notice, I mean, obviously the second clip was in like an abandoned warehouse, but like typically, you know, the Baroque flute would be played in more of a chamber setting, maybe a church where it's very resonant. If you're then talking about like a 3,000 seat auditorium with a symphony orchestra, it's probably gonna get lost in the shuffle.
It will.
Yeah. So just in terms of the Haynes Company and sort of how it sits in flute history, when did Haynes officially begin?
1888.
Wow.
So we've been running continuously since 1888. So we've seen 2 world wars. We've seen 2 pandemics now. Not me, obviously, but we as a group. Yeah, it's where it all began in terms of the American flute making.
Yeah.
Period. Like this is where we started, and a lot of the other companies now they all branch off, and you can see where they branch off from Haynes at different times. But yeah, we have original tools. That drop forge that you saw in the video, Haynes bought that used in 1888, and or maybe in the beginning. It wasn't probably right off the bat, but we still have it. We
Wow.
don't use it in the same way anymore. We use it for some parts, but not all. But it's still there. We've replaced the strap, I think, but other than that, it's the same. And a lot of our other machines are old. During I think World War II, we were used, and the military commissioned different companies to make different parts for like guns and ammo and stuff like that. And we found the blueprints of the bullets that Haynes made, and we still have the same lathes and machines that made those parts. So we're really conscious of our spot in history, and we make sure that we're always looking both ways, right? We want to make sure that we continue our tradition while we move forward. It's dangerous because we don't want to stagnate, right? We want to always make sure that we're looking forward and make sure that we're doing what flute players need us to do, and thinking ahead, but at the same time we can't forget where we came from. So that's the cool part about being in this building. Well, we're in a newer building now, but we have all the same stuff. Like we still have it in a good way.
That's amazing. And speaking of upholding the tradition while innovating, at least for me growing up, I know that one of the things that was always talked about was the Haynes sound. The Haynes sound, like the sound of a Haynes flute was like this very particular thing. And we've talked about how much of that is developed in the head joint making process. So is that something that you're always thinking about as you sort of evolve the head joints and craft them, is like trying to stick with that sound or keep a connection to that sound?
Yeah, is it a Haynes is the primary question when I make head joints. So I'll carve a head joint, and I'll get through most of the process, and then I'll have to test it. And I'm looking for an evenness of sound. So I want to make sure that, like the bottom isn't amazing while the top is tight, things like that. I want to make sure that it's even, but within the Haynes sound. We also make different head joint styles, and I don't look at them as sounding different. I look at them as different entry points into the Haynes sound, for different players.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's so very important, and that's kind of our thing. That's what we're thinking about all the time. We want things to be pretty, and we want things to feel good and be structurally sound, but it has to sound good. We're always, going back and making sure. And we have a team of people who are all very, very in touch with the Haynes sound. So we're going back and forth all the time. Because if I were to just do it in a box, right, and not check with my team and check with artists like you, Ben, and just make sure, am I still on track? I'm still on track. Then, I could, if I were doing it in isolation, I could veer off. I have to make sure that I'm always touching base with it and playing older flutes and playing current flutes. Yeah, it's always there. It's the primary thing I think about.
Well, and I think that the testament to all of that work is just the fact that the company is doing so well, and there's like waiting lists to get these flutes, and pretty much if you make a list of at least my favorite flute players, it's like most of them play Haynes now, and it's amazing. And I think that connection to the sound and to the history of the sound is a really big part of it, because it's obviously something that's been cultivated literally over a century, and I think you can tell that even when you play a brand new flute from Haynes, which is really cool.
We hope so.
you had mentioned that you had an older wooden flute
Do.
with you. Could we just show people that, just to show, this is, you said with a more modern mechanism, but an older flute, right?
Right. So it still has the berm system, right? So everything's working the same way. And I think it even has a thumb. It even has a thumb B flat. But yeah, this is I can't even read the number. It's a 20,000 flute. No, sorry, not 20,000. 2,000. So to put it in perspective, we're making flutes. So this flute right here is number 54,050. I have flute number 50,220, and that's from 1996.
I want to see what I have. 52,950.
Yeah, okay. But this is number 2066, I think. Yeah, so this is quite old. But yeah, this is what they looked like. It's seen some better days, right? It doesn't really. This is a little crooked.
So cool though.
Yeah, yeah. And the thing with wood flutes is they are warm. They are very warm, and they're thick, right? This one feels heavy. It also has a hole right here. It had a crutch. I don't think.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and the head joint looks a lot different than our modern head joints, right? So if you look at a metal head joint, I actually have one that I'm working on here. We have a lip plate, right? And that's to simulate the wood, you know, because this feels good. But if we just had the metal tube, it would not feel good. It would be very soft.
I had never thought about it that way.
Yeah, that's actually why we use a different, the riser on your head joint, the part that goes between the tube and the lip plate, we call it a riser, right? Because it raises the lip plate. And we also call it a wall. It's kind of an interchangeable word, because here, this is the wall. This is what we used to refer to as the wall, and now we have
a lot of sense.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, we're still kind of steeped in our vocabulary is still steeped in our wooden flute days, which we're woodwind, right? So, yeah.
Wow, that is really cool.
Yep.
So you know, when you're working on sort of not even just a particular flute, but just working on, you know, designing a style of flute or working on a head joint, what are some of the sort of difficulties that you have to overcome in terms of like the limitations that flutes typically have? Like, you know, I think about like low registers on the flute sort of being a point where you can really tell a good flute from a bad flute. Like, are there other things you sort of want to tackle as you're working on?
The flute makers have a lot more to tackle in a lot of ways. You know, one of the things is always the intonation of like the C sharp, right? And one of the things we could do to change that is raise our tone holes over here, right? But if we do that, we're going to lose a lot of our intonation, relational intonation, really, down in like E's and D's and things like that. So a lot of things we still have to compromise. We've come a long way in terms of intonation and things like that, but it is a balance. With head joints, everything's pretty much a balance too. It's a compromise. One of the things I had to actually learn is when to stop. Because I could go too far. I could, because there's always a perfect head joint out there, right? And I know that the testers are always searching for the perfect flute, but you can overdo a thing. In my case, I'll actually cut material off and it's gone forever. So I have to be careful. So that's the biggest thing with me is learning where the line is, and also, for me in particular, taking myself outside of myself to hear it. So I have to play a head joint, and it's very easy to adjust a head joint for what I feel. But I can't really do that. I have to do that too, but I also have to adjust it for what I hear. And I have to divide that. And I know that the flute testers have talked about the same thing too. That's a very difficult thing to do.
Well, I imagine it's also tricky because, you know, even as like a non-flute maker expert, I feel like one thing that I'm always thinking about, you know, other flute performers are thinking about is, you know, how you sound to yourself is not necessarily how you're going to sound out in the hall 50 feet away, and maybe some of the extraneous stuff up here is actually helping it project, and that's not going to get out there. Whereas, you know, it's sort of a balancing act where our own feedback to ourselves is like hearing yourself talk versus like hearing a recording of yourself. It's like very, it's sort of, I imagine that would be a big challenge as someone working on the sound of an instrument, is how do you figure out what's actually sounding?
Yeah. Yeah, that's why, I mean, that's why we have to try it in different locations. You know, I'll take every head joint that I cut and play it in my room, in the office that I play in, cut in, and then I'll go into the showroom and play it. We don't have the option of going to a hall, but we do, as much as we can, take head joints in and play and make sure that we're still on the right track. And that's a lot of times we rely on people like you, Ben, to give us feedback. You know, we're working with artists. Best case scenario is always to be working with artists as much as possible and getting feedback and changing things in real time. But yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned the showroom, and I just wanted to say for everybody, you know, Haynes is still located just outside of Boston now in Acton.
Acton, yeah.
And in Acton, Massachusetts, and they have a beautiful showroom. And so if anybody's in the area, you should definitely consider getting in touch. And
yeah, once we're
cool.
open up again, you know, because we're in the shop right now, but we're not open to the public. But we love to give tours and show people around. I actually started at Haynes when it was still on Piedmont Street. So in that video, a lot of us were there. We only moved here, and I think it was 2010. So this is a relatively new facility for us. But we had to.
Really cool.
Yeah, we grew. Our
Yeah.
demand grew, so we had to hire people, and the Piedmont Street location was not going to grow with us as much as
Well, I remember, for anybody out there, if there are flute enthusiasts who've been to the Piedmont location, it was, you know, very historic. And I remember when you guys announced you were moving, I was like, oh, that's so sad. But then I think you've done a really amazing job of preserving the history within this new building. And for anybody who goes there, if you go to the showroom, there's just so many things about the whole history of Haynes and who plays Haynes, and like statues and pictures, and it's very cool.
Yeah.
And then especially if you get to go see like the drop forge and the various different tools used to make the instruments. So we've had a lot of questions come in. Somewhat, Rosalind, hi Rosalind, has been asking what's the difference between gold and silver flute in terms of the sound. What's the best material used for flutes? And I think that sort of brings us to our next topic of, you know, we've talked about wood to metal, but within metal, as you mentioned, there's silver, there's gold, there's platinum, there are various combinations of these. Can you give us a sort of sense of what people tend to associate with these different metals and why a company would make them in different ways?
Yeah. So right now we're making flutes out of coin silver. We don't actually make them out of sterling silver, our custom flutes. Coin silver, 14 karat rose gold, 14 karat white gold, 19.5 rose gold, and platinum. So platinum too. So we have a wide variety. The general rule of thumb is as you add density, you're adding warmth, right? Or what we use is warmth. One of the, actually, going back to your previous question, one of the hardest things about flute making is working with flutists and making sure our vocabulary is the same. So warm doesn't always mean the same to everybody, but I'm gonna use warm for now and hope you guys, or color, right? So as you add density and as you add, you know, so gold is a denser metal than silver. It's going to take literally, this is all physics and I'm not a scientist, but it's going to take more air to make it move, right? So it's warmer. It also offers more resistance. You'll find people who want a darker tone going towards 14 karat rose gold, possibly the 19.5 rose gold. Rose gold is pretty dark. Platinum is too, and it's in a different way. Platinum has a different quality. Really what's happening is people are looking for a quality of sound that works with their physical makeup, right? And works with the aesthetics that they're going for. So like, I like a warm sound, but 19.5 for me when I play doesn't really work. It just, because of the way I play, it deadens my sound. Other people sound amazing on it, but I'm going to go 14K rose gold. And then 14K white gold, because of the alloy So when you've got rose gold, you're adding copper to the gold. So gold is yellow, right? So when you're adding, you add copper to make it that rose gold. When you've got white gold, you've added a lot of nickel, and that's hard. So that's white gold is very, very hard. So it's going to have a real like ping to the sound. It's very, very pingy, and it could be brighter. With some people, when I play it, I sound very bright. Some people sound amazing on it. So it's really a color preference and how you play.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting point too, because I think it's tempting to think, you know, if you think silver is a certain price level and gold is more expensive and platinum more, to think like, oh, like you're upgraded, like it's always an upgrade to move to the next one. Yeah. But I know lots of like very high level professional flutists who just, based on their, like you said, their physical makeup and the way they use their air, that gold just doesn't work. And for them, a silver flute sounds great.
Right.
And so it's really very individual. And, you know, we can't all be lucky enough to have our physical makeup be the cheapest option. But it is interesting to have all those different options. Could you show us, you mentioned that you had another flute that I thought was a really interesting combination.
So the whole thing with flutes is you can customize until your heart's content, really, within those metals. So this flute, oh, I didn't even mention this flute. This is the tube is 5% gold. So it's 95% silver, 5% gold. So you're going to have a little bit of the warmth of gold, but not all of it, right? But this one has, if you can see, the rings are gold. Can you see that?
Yeah, so that'd be, for everybody looking, it's right under the keys, like the little vertical.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, the rings, sorry, the rings.
The rings right here are gold. Also, the tone holes are gold.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so what would something like that do for the flutist or their sound?
It's going to supposedly, again, if it works for the player, it should warm up your sound, should darken it. A lot of times it really is literally an in-between step. Some people will like the way gold sounds, but not the whole gold flute. Maybe that's too much gold for them. And then they'll try something like this and it's just enough. You know, there are times when we'll add gold posts and ribs. So actually it's better if I take this apart and show you a rib. So if you look right here, can you see it? There's a little part right there. That's a post. And it comes out of a part that's right here called a rib. So there's the tube, and the ribs go on the tube, and the posts stick up, and then the keys get put on, right? We'll keep adding gold. We'll just keep adding gold to parts until you've got the weight and the density that you want. That's another thing. Gold is heavy. The more gold you add, especially these tone holes, they're thick. They're much thicker than the flute itself. So this flute's probably about 16 thousandths of an inch, but this is closer to half an inch, like
oh wow,
0.04, but no, not half an inch, 0.04. I was thinking head joint terms, but it's a lot thicker. It's like 2 or 3 times the thickness. So it adds a lot of weight, and sometimes people, they want the sound of gold, but they can't take the physical weight of it. So they'll add different gold parts, or they'll just get a gold head joint. Yeah.
So that's really interesting. We've had a couple other questions on this topic. So Ildiko wanted to know, and if I'm interpreting the question correctly, like typically would a performer come to Haynes, for example, and say, I'm looking for this type of sound, and you guys help them by suggesting materials, or do people typically come in and say, I want a gold flute? Like how? Okay.
Both happen. You know, sometimes people come in and they're dead set that they're going to sound great on gold, and then we're like, okay, and then we'll pull out all the gold flutes, but we'll pull out some silver flutes too, or some 5% golds, and then they'll try them, and then they'll be, oh, actually, I sound better on silver or something like that. It does happen. A lot of times people will come in and they'll just say, I don't know, they're just not sure. But they know that they're ready to change. And and if they tell us what they're looking to change, then we can usually figure out what they need. Usually if they're looking for a different color and they can put that into words, they can actually verbalize it, then
Yeah.
we can make an assessment there and start them where like set them in the most logical place.
Well, and I would imagine that also you mentioned that half of the people who work at Haynes actually have degrees in flute performance and are performers. I imagine that would also be really helpful as people come into the shop looking for an extra set or a few sets of ears.
Yes.
Like to see if they're achieving what they're going for. You guys can probably give them really good feedback in terms of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. We'll pull in people, new sets of ears and not give them
Yeah.
any information and just say, tell us what you hear. And then they can.
Yeah.
We're very lucky here with a lot of highly trained ears. Yeah.
Yeah. We also have another question about, I think Amir is talking about when you mentioned the wall or the riser, trying to figure out exactly what that is and how that impacts the sound.
I can help. So the head joint has 3 parts, all right? There's the tube, okay? There is the lip plate that is the most recognizable part, right? So, right? More or less, this head joint is exactly right. But in between those 2 parts is a riser. So it looks like this. And it is a casting, so it's actually heated up metal that's put into a mold and made into this shape. This is actually used, we use a hydraulic press. We don't use the drop forge.
Oh, wow.
Even though I know Lou DeVoe made a comment about how we wouldn't do that, but we did. Sometimes things actually do get too hard to work with. So we've got a riser and it gets soldered here. It gets soldered right in there. And then that gets soldered onto the tube itself. So that assembly gets soldered onto the tube. So this material, this right here, is what your air is actually hitting. So my job is to carve this once it's all soldered together. So the shape definitely changes the sound, but so does the material. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I feel like I'm learning a lot from all of this. This is great. Okay. I know we had other questions about this too. Moffrin wanted to know if the head, when you're working on head joints, does that include the crowns? And she asked about jewels possibly affecting the sound of crowns or different ways of making the crowns. So for everybody, the crown would basically be this decorative, well, it looks decorative piece on top that seals it.
So we are working with 2 crowns right now. We're working with a crown that we're putting on our classic head joints that go on our Q flutes, which is our sort of intermediate step-up flute. And we're also working with the crown that, Ben, you have on yours, and that going on our custom. We actually work with 2 weights on those now, but generally we're not changing up the shape of our crown at all as we go. Everything affects the sound, right? So the crown affects the sound, the cork assembly affects the sound. I remember like a while ago, people were they were taking their crowns off. I don't know why. Were you doing this? Were you putting rice in there?
I was told to put lentils in there, and then Finley, who also works at Haynes, got very upset with me.
So what was it supposed to accomplish?
I don't know. Someone told me that for everybody, that when you take the crown off, there's this space in the top in between the crown and the cork in there. And so I was told somewhere along the way that, oh, it's great if you fill that space with dried beans. And so someone suggested lentils. And I remember I was sort of ashamed to do it, but I was like, I'm not above this. And so I put lentils in there, and then Aiven's colleague, Finley, who's a friend of mine, I was in Boston, and I will usually go to his apartment, and he'll take a look at my flute. And as soon as he started to unscrew the crown, I remembered. And I said, oh, wait. But he got it off before I could say anything, and this lentil spilled out onto his workspace. And he was like, what the heck is this? And I was like, I'm sorry, someone told me that if I put lentils in there, it would help the projection. He said, Ben, I think if someone told you if you took a dump in your flute, it would sound better, you would run to the bathroom. I was like, okay.
I mean, I remember this being a thing though. Like people were doing that. And honestly, my whole thing is everything makes a difference. So maybe
Yeah.
it did. Or maybe it made like a rattle. But
Could be the
everything
percussion
is.
section too.
But yeah, but there's so many variables, and I'm not always able to work with the person who's going to play the flute. So I have to cut down my variables. So I always try flutes on the head joints on the same flute, always, no matter what. I always try them without a crown. The crown gets kind of matched up with the flute and the head joint at the end. When the final adjustments are being made. So if a lighter crown or a heavier crown is going on there, that decision is made then. But we keep that the same. The cork assembly and the inside of the head joint, which I don't have with me, the thing that's actually stopping the air, that's always the same. We make that exactly the same every time. So because there are so many variables, I'm going to hand cut that riser. I've got my scraper here. I hand carve it by hand, literally. Like there's no machine. I'm just doing it with this. I mean, there is enough that could go differently that we like to keep those variables as minimal as possible.
Yeah.
But in terms of the jewel, I don't know. I think really it's the shape of the crown and the weight of the crown that will make the biggest difference.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's really interesting. So we've had a few people ask how I selected my flute and what that process was like. I don't know how well you remember this, but it was sort of a process. Basically, when I won the job with the Pacific Symphony, I was playing on a silver flute, I think with a gold Haynes head joint. And I had been in touch with, again, Finley at Haynes about, maybe wanting to upgrade at some point, but I wanted to wait till I got tenure with the orchestra and made sure that I was going to be here and could afford to buy a new flute. And so as soon as that happened, I came to Boston and spent about a week. I had in my head that I really loved Haynes and wanted to buy a Haynes, but I felt like I was going to do my due diligence and go around. And like Aiven said, most of the flute makers that are in the US are right in this somewhat close vicinity. So it's pretty easy to go try out a bunch of different things. And very luckily, my guess was borne out, which was that I realized definitely Haynes was the flute that I wanted. And I think at that point, we sort of narrowed it down in terms of metals and what was going to work versus, my fingers also tend to be very, I don't know if it's acidic or what, but they tend to eat silver. So my silver flute is actually a black silver flute, which ends up sort of messing with the mechanism in certain ways. So I knew I wanted something maybe with no silver on it. And then I think basically you guys had a flute coming down the line that I was interested in that ended up being this flute. And we met up in New Orleans at the flute convention there in August. It was like 1,000 degrees. And I remember you and Finley and a few other people and I were in a hotel room in New Orleans, and you guys had this flute, and I was like, oh, I almost had a heart attack. I was so excited. And basically for the purposes of trying it and getting to see if it's the one I wanted before it went out to the showroom floor. And that's basically how I got this flute. And yeah, so like Aiven was saying, mine is it's a rose gold 14 karat flute. She was talking about the weight of things, and I don't know if I just use a lot of air or what, but for me, the weightier the better. So it's not only all gold, which makes it heavy, but then it's also the actual thickness of the wall is thicker than the standard. So it's called a heavy wall flute. So that's the story of that. And I think someone asked about if I play on other flutes. I not really, except for alto. I mean, I play different types of flutes, and I do have a wooden head joint that I'll sometimes put on this one, but this is my baby. So Aiven, I'm curious, obviously, like you said, the showroom is not open to visitors right now. And like we saw in the video at the beginning, a lot of the way that flutists and flute makers will come together will be at things like conventions, whether they're local or the National Flute Convention. And so I think obviously that's not happening right now with the pandemic. How has Haynes had to adapt for sort of this new world of whatever this is.
Whatever this is. Yeah, so we're still adapting for sure. I think this is just a growing, a ever evolving situation for us. It's very difficult for us in a lot of ways. Making flutes, in itself is a very much a community thing. We're trying each other's flutes and all that stuff. So that's kind of stopped for, slowed down. I'll test a head joint, I'll wipe down with alcohol, we'll wait, and somebody else will play it later. So in terms of flute making, this is very difficult. In terms of getting out to everybody else, it's been easier and harder at the same time, actually. We've been doing a lot of online, like e-flute festivals and classes. We have a Haynes University where we've got some of our artists going out and some of our flute makers going out and just doing things like talking to people that we wouldn't actually normally get to talk to. So our whole thing was, well, let's get to know people and let's show them who we are in an environment where, we don't normally get to do this. We've got people coming, like doing live streams from the shop, so you can actually see what we're doing, which actually, you don't get to do that at the flute convention, right? You just see us and you can barely hear anything and everyone's playing over each other. So that's been kind of good in a lot of ways. The world got a lot smaller, but it's not a good time to like go out and like test flutes. And we're still doing trials, and we'll do like virtual consults like this. Like we'll listen to you play, and we'll work with you. But that's a lot different. But we're still doing trials. People are still asking for flutes. People are still buying flutes, and we're still making them. So it's just a little bit. Like I said, it's good and it's definitely not good, but it's opened up some doors for us that we didn't really know were there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, sort of. I think probably very few of us would have predicted what was going to happen, that there was going to be a pandemic that, was going to halt life, basically. And I think it's interesting how the world has changed in so many ways, but some of them are unexpected and maybe not horrible ways. Like you sort of learn things as you go, and it sort of forces you to rethink a lot of how we do things and figure out what's really important. And I think obviously the same is true for, flute making and flute sales. We have a couple questions. So Ildiko wants to know when someone is looking at buying a flute, what kind of price range are they looking at for like a custom handmade flute?
Custom flutes, I think that we're starting off around 12,000 now, around 12 for a silver flute. And then we can go up to around 50,000 for the higher content golds and the platinum, 55 maybe, 56,000, I forget.
And is that really tied to like the price of gold in the market also?
Yeah, it's very much tied to the price of gold and platinum, and we have to actually, it's interesting, we have to gauge our purchasing too. Like we watch and because we're billed when we're getting the material, not when we order the material. So that's always a fun game.
Interesting.
But there's a wide range. You can get a gold flute with silver mechanism that's going to be a lot less expensive than a gold flute with gold mechanism. That mechanisms, all of this stuff, all of these parts here, they're pretty expensive. There's castings, and then there's machine parts, and like all sorts of different parts, and they're actually heavy when they're in gold. They're pretty heavy, so which is why we're adding weight. But those add a lot of value, a lot to the price tag. Yeah.
And I think obviously, like a lot of times when people will hear what a flute costs, particularly a flute made of a precious metal like gold or platinum, it's a little bit eye-popping. But then, like on the video, or when we're hearing about how many people are involved in making a single flute, and also how many hours go into it, and also like, you've been showing us just how intricate these. It really is like in the inside of a clock, or something like a fine-tuned clock, like all of these moving parts that have to be lined up exactly right. It's really like actually surprising to me that the cost can be kept where it is.
Yeah.
And especially if you compare with like a string instrument where, they just get astronomical very quickly.
Yeah, yeah. And it's still, he mentioned in the video that, you know, it's all made by hand, and it still is largely. I mean, we've changed some of our process. Like I said, we use a hydraulic press now instead of the drop forge. That, I mean, you know, when he said it was 130 hours, I mean, I think we've only cut like 10 hours from that. I think we're at like 120 hours. I mean, all that stuff with the files and the detailed handwork, that is still exactly what we're doing. I'm literally, you can cut a head joint with a machine, but I won't, and we won't, because we want that human component. We want me doing that, installing the angle and installing this, you know, the shape. So yeah, that's a lot. A lot of the cost is right there too.
Well, and I think, you know, that's also why people are drawn to a company like Haynes, is because people want that handmade product that also is going to be somewhat unique for them. And also a lot of human attention and care has gone into each one, which I think is very special. We have a question from Teddy, who wants to know if you guys would ever consider a Lizzo model flute.
Why not? I don't know what
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
You guys do have do you still have a James Galway model flute?
We do. Yep. It's our Q series. Yeah, we do. He came and he worked with us, and we made it to his specifications. Yeah.
Awesome. And I remember at one point there was also a replica of Jean-Pierre Rampal's yellow gold flute that was really cool.
Yeah, I think that's before I got here. I think that was right before I got here that they were making those. I remember that.
So it's definitely not out of the realm of possibility. I think we need to contact Lizzo.
Yeah.
That'd be amazing. Well, let's see if we have... Oh, well, here's a very sort of technical question for you. Susan wants to know, I guess how, like, corks in particular, like, how would the aging of a cork differ in an arid environment like the desert in Arizona versus someplace humid like Boston? Like, do you notice, or other things like the pads, like, is where you live with the flute really, does it affect how the flutes work and are repaired?
Yes. You know, again, I am lucky because I get to deal with new head joints. So I barely ever have to deal with an old cork. So I am actually not always the best person to ask, but I know that the more you play, the more that will wear. And if you are in one end or the other, if you're in like a desert or a rainforest, your flute is going to go through a lot more than, you know, if you're around where I am, or you know, in a more temperate environment. Those pads will get sticky in a more humid environment, and if things crack out, or if things dry up, they're going to crack, right? So you just have to pay attention to that. And I think the same is true of the head joint cork. If it dries up, it's going to be too small, right? So you're going to want to get that replaced more often if you're in a dry environment or an overly wet environment. You're going to want to change that. We recommend like COAs, which is a clean oil and adjust, and would involve the changing of that head joint cork every 12 months to 18 months. Just to check on the whole thing. There's also oil in the mechanism. So in these rods right here, there's actually steels going through them, and then things have to move around the steels. So there's oil in there, and that can dry out. So it's good to get those checked on, especially if you live in one of those environments.
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting stuff you never really think about. So it is a little after 5, and I don't want to keep you too long. We have maybe 1 or 2 more questions if you have time. And also for Janet, who's joining us, yes, if you came in partway through, this will be on Facebook later, and I believe possibly YouTube. So if you want to see the rest, the beginning, that will be there. So Amira had a couple questions which I thought were really interesting. First of which, you know, we think of gold as being a very soft metal. So what she was asking, so does that mean things are gold plated or platinum plated? But it really has to do more with the alloy that you put it with, right, to harden it?
Yeah. One of the biggest misconceptions that I have to talk about is the hardness of it. Yeah. So gold is very soft. It is. But when we're talking about the alloys that we're dealing with the copper or the nickel or things like that, gold is very hard. So it is very sturdy. It is very hard. When I'm actually hand carving the head joints, I can tell you, no questions, silver's the softest metal I deal with. The 14 karat gold is okay. The 18 karat white gold is super, super hard. Like, and I can clear out a room with the sound it's making. Yeah, it's terrible. Platinum is, we have a platinum riser. We make that riser out of platinum. That is so unbelievably hard that it's almost, I feel like I'm cutting glass. Like, it's like,
Wow.
like I'm not even sure I'm doing something for a while, and it does work. The scraper I'm using is harder than all of them, right? It literally, it's just steel. I've tried harder metals to cut with to make it easier for myself, but I've found them to be slippery. But yeah, the alloys themselves, that gold alloy is very hard.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then final question, also from Amira. These are awesome. She wants to know if pressing the metal versus heating and molding the metal makes a difference in the sound. So I would assume this would be like the rolled tubes or seams, I don't know the terms, versus...
Pressing the metal as opposed to heating. Yeah. Anytime you put anything under pressure, it's going to get harder, right? So, like our castings, I think would be naturally softer than the materials that, like, so, like a key or like one of these that's a casting is going to be softer than this, which is stamped, right, with a press. So yeah, we've made decisions. In fact, actually, some of the decisions we've made are precisely because things were too hard when they were stamped over and over and over. I have a flute from 1996, and this is terrible. One time I left it on my car, and I drove, and it fell off. It was awful. And nothing happened to it. Like that thing is iron. But as the padders, the people who put pads in will tell you that it's actually too hard. It was too hard. There was no give. They couldn't bend anything. So sometimes it's just too hard. But yeah, pressure will make things harder.
Yeah, interesting. Well, this has been absolutely amazing. I feel like I've learned a lot. I hope everybody out there has learned a lot. We are officially done. I brought a piece for me to play for those of you who want to stick around, just so we can sort of get, I don't know, some sort of a demonstration of a lot of the things we've been talking about and how we create different sounds on these flutes, and obviously a flute that Aiven was key in developing and making. This is a piece that I wrote during quarantine, so please be nice. Or not, I would love the feedback. But Aiven, thank you so much. And it's great to see you, and amazing to talk to you. And for those of you who can stick around, here is my untitled piece. We'll call it Opus 2. Oops. So, hi everybody. Thanks so much for listening. Aiven, thank you again so much for being here. If people are interested in learning more about Haynes, wmshaynes.com. And this full thing will be on Facebook and YouTube. So if you missed anything or want to check it out again, please feel free. Thank you guys so much.